welcome everybody tonight. Once again, thanks for coming out on a cold winter night to think about golf. It's a little ironic, but better than being outside on night tonight anyway. So to pick up where we left off last week, we had started to look at rating obstacles, and we had discussed topography, some length, and fairway. And so tonight we're going to pick that discussion up at green target. So can you put me on the overhead camera then? Okay, so once again, what I'd like to do is just take a look. I know you've been reading ahead and you're quite familiar with these tables now, so I just would like to just talk a little bit about using them and in particular the appropriateness of some of the adjustments to the tables. The one thing that I always try to stress with fairly new raters is how much sense this whole system makes. It's a really outstanding example of numerical modeling. And for example, if you take a look at the green target table, I'll look at the men's because it shows up just a little bit better contrast on the document camera here. In the body of the table, you can see all the obstacle values as usual. And the thing that and then of course the two entry points of it's like throwing darts, I guess, the length of the shot you have to the dart board and some measure of the size of the dart board, the size of the target. So it seems to me that it would be obvious, I guess, that and in some ways these obstacle values are a measure of how difficult the hole is from that obstacle's perspective. In other words, how difficult it is it to hit the green with the shot that you're supposed to hit the green with. And if you take a look at this, it just makes ultimate sense that the 2 would be the easiest. So all these numbers up in the corner here represent the easiest shots, and you can see they're all the shortest shots into the largest greens. So, and the interesting thing about it is if you take a look at the top row, when you're less than 60 yards away or less than 30 yards away from bogey, it really doesn't matter what the size of the green is. You will hit all greens of all sizes with equal ease. And of course, the corollary to that is down in the lower right-hand corner here. All the really difficult shots, as exemplified by the high obstacle values, are the long shots, the very long shots, greater than 240 and greater than 180 for the man, into really small greens. So all of the tables are designed that way, and I think it's kind of reassuring that they make that much sense. So I'm going to talk here about the entry points again. Let's take the easier ones first. The length of the shot in, of course, is pretty easy, except you have to be careful that it doesn't always end up being what you thought it was going to be. I don't know how other teams are organized, but I can't imagine a team that could go out and rate a golf course without the team leader or somebody else on the team laying out all what I call the anticipated landing zones. And if you're going to anticipate where landing zones are on a golf course without going there, pretty much all you have to go by is the length of the hole and the assumption that it plays straight away. So that's the assumption I make when I'm laying these out. And of course, you just simply, on a one-shot hole, it's the length of the tee shot is your shot into the green. It's a par 3, you're expected to hit it with your tee shot. On a par 4, 2-shot hole, it's a full shot, whatever you scratch or bogey, and you subtract that distance from the length of the hole, and that gives you the remaining shot into the green. So you can lay these all out in advance, and they will be. And if you take a look on the Form 1, I don't want to disrupt my overhead here, but if you look on a Form 1 next to the row that green target is on, you'll notice there's a shot length, and then there is an adjusted shot length. And so the shot length that's written in there will usually be the one that your team leader determines in advance. That's what you're anticipating it to be. And the reason there is a special column for an adjusted shot length is because it gets adjusted quite a bit. You remember all those examples we did with Google Earth Pro that we took a look at the shot in and how it differed from the anticipated shot in, and that difference would determine then the effective playing length correction for the hole. But even if you had well, not even if, as well as that, you could have had a roll on a previous full shot that that wasn't full, less than 20 yards of roll because of the slope of the fairway, the tilt of the fairway. And so your shot into the green is lengthened maybe by 5 yards. So instead of being 95 yards, as it's written on the Form 1, it becomes 100 yards. Or it could have hit on a downhill slope and then gone to a shorter shot in. So that's one thing you have to be certain that you've taken into account any EPL adjustments that have occurred on the hole before you get to the approach shot. But usually that's pretty easy to do, and we don't have too much trouble with that. An interesting thing is happening here. For next year, they're going to go to 6 columns only instead of 7. Not sure what the reasoning is for that. The last column is going to be less than 12, and the final column is going to be greater than 32, I believe. So they're trying to compress it down into 6 columns, but they're exactly the same for the men's and the women's charts. And as a matter of fact, the body of the chart, if you take a look at any row or any column, the numbers in the 2 tables are exactly the same. Everything's identical except the shot lengths. Now, I haven't heard that they're going to do it, but it would seem to me that would almost an invitation to make a combined green target table here, and by simply taking this row, which is the shot lengths for the scratch woman, and putting it over here to the left of the scratch man's shot lengths, and then taking the bogey shot lengths. They're out of my field of view here, but you can put that, I'm not going to bother moving it. You can put them over here to the right-hand side. And those of you that have a updated obstacle table for penalty area lateral will realize that they've already done that. And our team spent the year dealing with that, and we had no trouble at all using the same chart for women and for men, but each shot length was in a different column specific to the women or specific to the men. I want to talk a little bit, though, about the effective green diameter. This is crucial to this, and it's something that you have to do at every hole, figure out the size of the target. If the green is a circle, that's not a problem. It's just the diameter of the circle. But if it's other than a circle, you can get into some calculating that you have to do. There's a page at the back of the manual. This doesn't really deal with the ones that I want to talk about so much. So before I do that, I'm going to talk about the standard ones, I guess. So the standard one is, I'll just draw a little sketch. The standard one's a circle, and whatever the diameter of the circle is, that's the diameter you're going to use. So if it's a 25-yard circle, then 25 is the effective green diameter. These are all effective green diameter calculations, but circular greens can often stretch into ovals. And so on an oval, you'd have a long axis and a short axis. Could be an ellipse and whatnot. But depending on the orientation of this oval to the line of play, and it doesn't matter really what the orientation is. It doesn't matter whether it's length like this, or it's elongated along the line of play, or even oblique to the line of play. The target's the same size. It's just that we would call this one the depth and this one the width, and of course it's just D plus W over T for the effective green diameter. You just average it. That works as long as the oval isn't elongated. If you get an elongated, a really elongated oval, and what makes it that, the formula kind of falls apart here because the green is harder to hit than the math. If you did the same math, then the math would predict. Simply because you have such a small margin of error for one of the dimensions. The other oval, of course, that's similar to this would be the one that's like that. Like that, same thing. And so here you have to be a little bit creative. And we describe the amount of elongation of the oval by the ratio of the one to the other. So this is the W. Nope, that's the D, sorry, on this configuration, and this is the W, and D has to be greater than, well, 2D has to be greater, anyway. The relationship is 2 to 1. Easier for me to write it that way. So one of the dimensions has to be greater than the other by factor of 2, and greater than, not equal. Or it could be this way, where it's the depth that's the long dimension, and the width that's the narrow one. And here we make use of something that we do quite frequently in course rating, and that would be a weighted average. So the effective green diameter in this case is the long measurement, W, plus twice short dimension divided by 3. And I gave a couple of examples in the workbook. If you take a look at the results that you get when you use this weighted average and compare them with the results that you get if you didn't cotton to the fact that it should have been a weighted average, you took a simple average, then you'd find that the effective green diameter for the weighted average is considerably lower than the simple average, as it should be, because these are harder to hit. So those are pretty standard, and you can go to a 3-to-1. If it's a 3-to-1 green, then it would be one dimension, let's say the width plus the depth plus the depth plus the depth over 4 ad nauseum with that. We have, over the years, our team has taken 2 other kind of shapes that come up from time to time and devised a little way of dealing with them. What you're trying to do is come up with a reasonable estimate of the size of the target, and the theory being is the effective green diameter of any green, regardless of its shape, would be the diameter of a circle that has the same area as that odd-shaped green. So you find kidney-shaped greens the odd time, maybe like that. And if the line of play is this way, then this is the width. This is the width here. But you have a whole bunch of different depths. And so where do you measure the depth? It depends where you measure it. You're going to get a different value. If you measured it here, then that would imply that it would be like measuring a green that was that shape, and you're including a lot of area on this green that really isn't on the green, so that's not going to work. And so what we've done is we've taken a look at this and said, well, you have to imagine what the pin choices are going to be for the person that's going to be setting the pins. There's not much depth here to work with, so the old habit of having a blue pin at the back and a white pin in the middle and a red pin at the front is not going to work much here. You don't have enough depth to deal with that. So what they're probably going to do is have 3 pin positions or something like this. And pretty much every day, this pin is going to be somewhere in here and whatnot. So what we usually do is we take a reading of the depth there. We take a reading of the depth there. We take a reading of the depth there. And we simply average them. And that seems to produce a result that accounts for the fact that one of the depths is so much smaller than the other 2 that you shouldn't include this area here that you would include if you took a simple oval. Another one that we run into from time to time is a sort of a pear-shaped green. Say we do it this way. Something like that. Doesn't look enough like an oval to consider it an oval. So what we sometimes do in this situation like this, you're only limited by your own creativity here, and I encourage people to do this. I mean, it's pretty accurate. So what we would say is here, well, if the pin was down here, this would be the width you would use. And if the pin was in the middle, this would be the width. And if the pin would be back here, this would be the width. And so you could do the same thing there. You could have 3 different widths and average them. And then the depth would be a constant. Or if it was even more, because that's most likely where the pins are going to be. There might be a pin there, there might be a pin in the middle, might be a pin at the back, and your target when the pin is in the middle of the back looks a lot bigger than your target when the pin is at the front. So those are the ones that you deal with, and I'd say those situations probably cover 95% of the greens you're ever going to run into, or 90%. The ones in the book, they talk about this situation. That's close enough to an oval that I think you'll be adding a little green here that shouldn't be and a little green here that should be. So you might take a little bit off one of these dimensions, or maybe come up with a depth that's kind of an average of the others. It's a sort of an exercise in approximation, but it's a good one. as far as these other ones are concerned, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because I don't even remember how to do them myself. These are the ones, I've run into one of these in 18 years of doing this, maybe two. The 17th green at Glen Abbey looks very much like this one. And so when we came to that, I said, oh, I know where there's a good resource for this, page 36 of the guide. We all went over and looked at it then and figured out at that point. I figured it was excess information for me to carry them out of my brain for 18 years to use only once. So I don't worry too much about those when you come up with them. The interesting one, though, is just because a green is tiered, this comes up time from time to time. Just because a green is tiered, you might be tempted to say, well, because of the tier here, there's not going to be any pins on the tier. So this is like having two greens. It's like having one here and one here. But the guidance you get on this one is that it's best described as having an average diameter. So if this were, you could have the length this way, for example, and the width could be maybe 2/3 of the pins are up here because this is twice the size of this one. And the guidance is that you're better to do it that way than use it as two circles and adding them together. Okay, so let's go back now then. I think that's all I wanted to do with the use of the chart. Everybody's fairly good. We don't have too much trouble using this chart, but I want to take a look at the obstacles, because as I said before, the adjustments, I mean, as I said before, these tables all describe the most innocuous or vanilla situation possible. And then any other complexities are addressed by looking at the adjustments. So here are the adjustments that we use on this hole, and the adjustments are evaluated separately for scratch and bogey. The V adjustment's a good one. It's common. Almost always when you're hitting uphill to the green. When you're hitting a shot from the approach landing zone downhill to the green, you can usually always see most of the green. The only ones that are a little odd are when you're on a level shot, but there's a rise between you and the green. You're basically on a level with the green, but sometimes there's a mound in front of the green, or what you think is a mound is actually the back lip of a bunker that fronts the green that you have to carry. So the theory being that it's going to be harder to hit that green if all you can see is the flagstick and you can't see how much green there is to one side of the flag or the other. Now, if you play the course enough, you probably know that anyway, but the theory is that this warrants adjusting the green target value up by 1. And of course, by 2, if you can't see anything, there's a hole at my club that's like this. And so whatever the green target table value is, the final value would be +2 because you can't see anything, can't see the flag at all. So you just have to hit it up there and hope you pick the right color for that day. The obstruction, pretty obvious. It really reduces the effective green size that you have to aim at. But it's got to be a tree acting as an obstruction has got to be somewhere along what you would expect to be the line of flight. If you're hitting a wedge in and there's a tree that's 10 feet high and it's off to one side and it kind of would be in a line with one corner of the green, I don't know whether you'd want to use it there. Remember, if you add a +1 for an adjustment to a table value of 3, say, you're increasing the obstacle value by 33%. That's a significant change. So you have to make certain that this really, in fact, does cut off part of the green's availability to you for the shot that you're hitting. If the green is tiered, this is just because tiered greens are harder to stay on. If you hit on the wrong tier, it's just not as good as being on the regular green, on the non-tiered green. I've never used this one in all these years, unusually firm. I guess if you're going to use this adjustment, you probably use it on every green because it's probably a golf course where they don't irrigate the greens properly or something, but I've never used this F adjustment in my lifetime. So The other thing I wanted to mention here is the issue of false fronts. Greens that are mounded, a little bit of humped green, I guess you'd call it. It's possible for a ball to roll onto the green and stop and roll off again. It just won't stay on the green when it should have. If the green was level, it would have stayed. And there's no adjustment for that. What we simply do is don't count the part of the green the ball won't stay on. Been corrected, but now for the last 10 or so years, we just place the ball somewhere. So if you suspect there's going to be a false front or a false side, you just walk off and go 2 feet on the green, say, put the ball there. If it rolls off, then you go 3 feet on. If it rolls off, keep going until it stays. You just place it on the green and see if it stays there. And if it does, then you measure the green size as if that was the front of the green. So anticipated change in this table for next year. I don't think there's much, because I think I've already told you that. The one thing I want to spend a moment or two talking about on this one is the whole transition zone issue. It's something that kind of bothers people a little bit, and it's been made a lot simpler when they put this transition zone row into the table. The transition zone row is not esoteric at all. It's just the average of the shortest shot you could possibly have if you don't make it, and the longest shot you could possibly have on the green if you do make it. So they're all just the average, and they round them up if they're a 0.5. Back in the day, some of us used to get so sophisticated, we'd say, okay, this row wasn't on the table then, so we'd say, I think you can make it 3 times out of 10. So you'd say that means 3 times, let's say it's a 23 green. That means 3 times he's going to hit it with this long shot, and the green target's going to be 7. And the other 7 times he's going to hit it with this shot, and it's going to be 2. So if you add those up, you get 7 times 2 is 14, plus 3 times 7 is 21, and 14 is 35. That runs off to 4, which makes it a little less than this, but it should be less because you're only making it 3 times out of 10. So I think it was a lot of work for next to nothing, doing all these weighted averages of how many times you make it. So now they've given us guidance, I think it's 2 editions ago, we've been doing this for a long time, saying that if it's a transition hole, now everybody knows what that is, I guess, say a par 3 that's 10 yards longer than the normal scratch maximum tee shot length, and a par 4 or a 5 that's 20 yards, that's in the 20 yard longer, up to 20 yards longer, where the potential is there to every so often hit it with 2 shots if it's a par 5, and 1 shot if or 2 shots if it's a long par 4, 1 shot if it's a long par 3 that you really shouldn't be able to hit with your tee shot. So anyway, you just have 3 choices now. If you believe that you can hit it half the time you're going to get there with the long shot, then this is the row you use. If it's more than half, you use the value in this row plus 1. And if it's, excuse me, less than half the time, in other words, you think you'll miss it more than you get there, then it's the value in this row minus 1. And that turns out to be a pretty good approximation of what we used to do in the old days when we did all the weighting averages. One of the problems with this thing, let's see if I can describe this simply to you, that's a bit of a problem, is sometimes the ones you don't make it with are still on the green after 2. If it's a deep green, and making it to a green means getting to the middle of it, hitting it far enough that you can get to the middle of the green. So if the middle of the green is at 478, and you go 471, and you're on the green, then you'll think I've made it. But for the purposes of the transition zone, you haven't. For the purposes of the transition zone, you have to get to the middle of the green to be considered to have made it. Now, the problem is, in that case, then you haven't made it with the second shot. And normally when you don't make it to the green on a par 5 in your second shot, you have a second landing zone in front of the green. And that landing zone has all of the associated obstacles with it. It has a width and it has a distance, and there could be fairway bunkers beside it and all that sort of stuff. And so there's been a clarification, and I'm just going to give you a quick advance. I think it's a big improvement, but it's going to take people a little bit of time to get used to it. If you make it at least half the time, you use this value or this value plus 1. If you don't make it at least half the time, what you do is you go to a designated landing zone that's 10 yards short of the green. Okay? It's probably not really what's going to happen, but it's the way it will make it uniform for everybody. And it will give you that second landing zone that you'll need on a par 5 if you don't make it in 2. And that landing zone won't be on the green because it's a big, deep green. So that's the way they're going to handle that next year. And so for that shot, then you'll be considered to have hit a full second shot, and any of the other obstacles that are around that landing zone will be evaluated as full second shots to that landing zone. We'll do more of that in the spring, but that to me is an improvement because it does clarify a situation that we've always had a bit of trouble with when people say, well, I can get on this green in 2, even though the green's like 480, because the green's 30 yards deep, and it's 15 yards from the front back to the middle, so I only really have to go to 65 to get on the green if the goal is 480. Anyway, let's leave that. That's something coming up next year, but I think it will make dealing with transition zone holes a little easier. Duncan and I have talked about the possibility of having a 5th webinar when these ones are finished, and proper treatment of a transition hole, like going right through a transition hole from beginning to end, would be one of the things that we would probably try to do if we have that. There's a couple of other situations that we'd like to look at that are kind of sticky. So let's just leave our discussion of transition zones right now for that and move over to rough and recoverability. So rough and recoverability is the, can you give me a bit less zoom? Rough and recoverability then is the obstacle that deals with the impact on scoring of missing your targets, basically. So if you miss, it's assumed that if you miss the fairway landing zone, you'll be in rough. And if you miss the, let me go up here for now. If you miss the green, you'll also be in rough. The standard golfing layout is that the fairways are bordered by rough and the green is surrounded by rough. And therefore, this obstacle then is deals with the difficulty you'll have hitting your next shot out of the rough if you miss the fairway landing zone, or hitting some sort of a chip shot, wedge, flop shot, recovery shot from around the green if you miss the green with the shot that's supposed to hit the green. And here's why green target, I'll just use the men's target, the men's chart for an example. Here's why green target is so important, because it's the one that we use to enter this table to get the row. Scratch from the left, this is sort of standard procedure, and bogey enters from the right. And in some ways, well, not in some ways, in all ways, this kind of makes sense, because the scratch green target is related to how difficult it is to hit the green. So in some ways, it's the rough beside the green that we're using in order to get you in the right row here. So the harder it is to hit the green, the higher the green target value is going to be, and therefore the greater the more difficulty of the shot, therefore the larger obstacle value. So as you go from small green targets for any length of rough, you notice the obstacle values get larger as you go to larger green targets, because there's more chance of you being in that rough. So most people would agree with that part. The average rough of the hole is, of course, the issue. Everybody who plays golf knows that the reason the U.S. Open is so difficult usually is the rough's somewhere up in these regions, all the rough. And so the columns are determined by the average rough of the golf course. And it's hard to know what that is, but we usually would just talk to the golf course staff and say, what do you have your rough mowers set at? And say, 2 inches or 2 1/4, whatever. And then how often do you cut the rough? And if it's every 2 or 3 days, and you would say to them, well, how long is it when the day before you cut it? Therefore, it's the same length as your blades are set the day after you cut it. And anyway, you arrive at a rough length for the course, and we usually use that for the whole course, all the way around the course. Almost all golf courses have one set of rough mowers, and so the notion there'd be different lengths of rough at different places on the course really doesn't hold much water, I don't think. I would say that 80% of the courses that we do in Ontario are in this row, 2 to 3 inch for men, and the comparable row for women's a little easier, 2 to 2 1/2 for women. If it gets to be more than 2 1/2, the women get to jump up into the next row and get higher obstacle values for the same green target. So this is pretty simple to do. You really don't have anything to measure. You've already determined the green target rating in the previous step. You've already determined the green target rating in the previous step, and you already know what the rough length is around the course, so that's pretty easy. The difference between warm season and cool season grass, I don't know why they use those names, but cool season is what we have in the northern hemisphere, up in more than the northern hemisphere, I guess, the northern United States and most of Canada. Warm season is tropical. It has to do with the different types of grasses. And you notice the equivalence that for tropical grasses, warm season grasses, the shorter length warm season grass is equivalent to the longer length cool season grass in terms of degree of difficulty to play from it. Okay, let's take a look at some of the obstacles, the adjustments for these tables. These are subject to, these ones have been difficult to deal with because they're just not concrete enough. L is no problem. L is a shot specific adjustment. If the player lays up on the hole, then the table values are going to be too high because he's going to be in the fairway more often. This refers mainly to the fairway rough. You don't lay up going into the green, but he's going to be in the fairway more than he would be if he was hitting full shots, and therefore the values in the table are going to be too high based on the length of shot he had to hit to avoid going in the rough. And it's shot specific, so I guess there's holes where you have to lay up twice. But if you had to lay up twice, then you'd use the -1 twice, and the table value would be subject to an adjustment of -2 before it became a final value because of that. So, and this occurs whether it's forced or by choice. If it's by choice, you don't get an effective playing length correction, but you do get the layup adjustment on fairway and on R&R. This one is pointless as far as I'm concerned. Hardly ever used it. The one time we had to use it is at a USGA seminar, calibration, where they try to trick you anyway. And they try to trick us by putting a hole on where the rough was inconsistent. That there was a par 3 where the rough around the green had been cut way back. It's like 30 yards away from the green with collection areas and everything. And we were supposed to have said this was a -1 adjustment because normally when you're that far, if you miss the green by that much, you're supposed to be in the rough. And this time you weren't. So I think that one, I know that one's going to be eliminated the way it is right now. I'll tell you in a minute what it is. Once again, the vanilla situation for these tables is the only thing that's a problem for you is the length of the grass. But you all know that's not the only problem when you're in the rough. If you happen to be in the rough and you're on down slopes or side slopes or mounds, or your stance is a bad issue, that makes it much more difficult. So the adjustment for mounding or hollows, a hollow is an inverse mound, so it's just as difficult when you're in a hollow, either near the fairway landing zone or closely bordering the green. In other words, the places you'll be hitting from if you miss your target. are qualify for an adjustment of +1. It becomes much more difficult to recover from there, therefore warrants a higher obstacle value. So the question though is, and they say consider their severity, number, and location. So I understand why all those things matter, but the question is, how much consideration would there be if there's just one little mound, not very high, not all that close to the green, and that everything else around the green was level. And so that's a question we always get. People say there are mounds, but are there enough of them to warrant a +1 adjustment, which may very well be increasing the value by 25% or 33%, or making a significant change in the obstacle value. So there's a solution next year to that problem too. If you look at the heading of the tables, again, the vanillaness of the table is, and this is where you really need to be careful, because all greens are different. All the areas around the greens are all different. So this assumes that the green it's relatively level around the green. In other words, it assumes 5 feet or less of rise from low area up to the green, or drop from, you don't see this as much, but from an area that's higher up around the green down to the green of 5 feet or less. But if it's more than that, and you have that from time to time, then you get into this rise and drop adjustment. And of course, it doesn't really matter whether it's a rise or a drop. They both are a positive adjustment, because they're both going to make it more difficult to hit the green with the chip shot. The hard thing for people to understand is do not include any area that is closely bordered by bunkers. And the reason for that is that if the bunkers have their own way of dealing with the fact that you have to hit a shot either down to a green that's well below you or up to a green that's well above you. That takes care of itself. And so that this adjustment excludes rises and drops that are in bunkers, because the bunker depth adjustment, as you know, will take care of that. So it has to be at least a half of the green excluding the bunker. So if you've got a situation where half the green is already surrounded by bunkers, you can't possibly have rise or drop. There's not a half of the green's perimeter left to rise or drop. So that's always a tricky calculation. People say, well, you know, there's a rise or drop here, and I say, yeah, there certainly is a lot, but I don't think it's half of the total perimeter of the green, because look at all the part that's taken up by bunkers that we can't count. And so there's two adjustments here. It has to be greater than half to qualify to start with, and then the one adjustment is when the rise or drop is greater than 5 feet. There's no adjustment if it's less than 5 feet, because the table covers that. And if it's 5 to 10 feet or more than 10 feet, then you get the two adjustments. The surrounded adjustment I'll get to later when we get back. This is something you have to do when you come back. So I'll get to that later. This one, the unpleasant adjustment, is always been one that's been difficult to deal with, because it's basically when the expectation that there would be rough closely bordering the green isn't there. You expect that if you just missed the green by 5 or 6 or 8 yards, or 5 or 6 yards or so, that you're going to be in the rough. But a lot of these course designers have now taken to having collection areas, and not only if you miss the green, you just don't roll off a couple of feet and then you're stopped in the rough. Rough and have an easy chip. You get a drink of water. They can roll down hills on this fairway length grass, and you can be 30 yards away. So that was meant to account for this, but it was always difficult to say, you know, is there enough of this here for it to be a +1? So it wasn't used very often. And then they lumped in it with a whole other issue, this unpleasantness caused by hardpan. Got nothing to do with cutting the grass. It's a course maintenance issue. So anyway, apparently they're going to come out with some guidance on using the inconsistent and the mounds together, and the unpleasant adjustment are going to be combined. I'm anxious to see how it comes out, because it can't be any worse than it is now, and it can only be better. The last couple of things, if the rough closely bordering 2 or more landing zones on a par 5 hole is at least 4 inches, I don't think I've used that once too. That was in a question on last year's calibration exercise at the USGA. So they look for these obscure things that you never use and put them on the test. So, you know, you gotta, I don't know why this would be unless it's just area that they don't mow. And we used to deal with that, not through an R&R, but through the OBER, the extreme rough obstacle, which we don't have anymore. This is one that, though, it comes up all the time, and that is the bogey carry adjustment, and it's meant to account for the difficulty encountered by the bogey golfer off the tee, where the course superintendent has decided to contour the fairways, and the fairways don't start right in front of the tee. You have to hit the ball a certain distance to just get to the fairway, and sometimes that distance is more than the bogey golfer can hit it. So I'm not going to go into the table too much, but it's something you just have to be aware of. The bogey woman runs into this problem all the time because she can only fly at 130 yards off the tee. And so if you take a look at it, it has to do with the length of the normal rough and the distance that you have to carry to get to the fairway. The next one is a really important one, so important that I'm going to leave it for now, because it's the one that you have to bring into play when you have an unreachable par 3 for the bogey golfer. So that is for the women, a par 3 that's from 150 to 210 yards. 210 is the top level for a par 3, 150 is as far as the bogey woman can hit it. So for her, it feels like it's a par 4. And the problem is that on a par 4, part of your total obstacle value for the hole should be a fairway obstacle rating, but you can't have fairway ratings on par 4. So in some ways, this is a way of compensating the bogey golfer for having to hit an area that in any other circumstance would be a fairway, but it can't be in this case because you're not allowed to have a fairway rating on a par 3 hole. And there's two adjustments. One is when it looks quite a bit like a fairway, and that is it's 20 yards wide. That's a narrow fairway, but at least it's cut to short grass and it's 20 yards wide. And then an even greater adjustment of +2 when there's no fairway even there. It's just regular rough right up to the front of the green. And then you get a +2 adjustment because, first of all, you're not going to get as much roll. Secondly, you don't have as good of an aiming point. And thirdly, you're probably going to have a really, not a really difficult lie, but you're certainly going to have a more challenging lie when it comes time to hit your next shot. Okay, so I'm going to accelerate a little bit here if I can. Greenside bunker tables. The bunker situation is fairly easy to deal with. Once again, it deals with how likely you are to get into the bunkers is determined by your green target rating. If your green target rating is low, you're not likely to get into the bunkers when you hit into the green because either the green is very big or the shot is very short. Conversely, if the shot is very long, if your green target is, or the green is very small, then you're likely to get in the bunkers, and that's the higher green target ratings here. And for purposes of quantizing it, then we have to divide the area. And of course, the chances of getting into the bunkers are greater the more there are of them. And it's not really the more there are, it's the area of them around the green. So the way they quantize this is by what quartile of the green is surrounded closely by bunkers. And there's a whole bunch of ways on the course of doing this. Some people paste them off. Some people try to envision a pie chart where one edge of each piece of pie is you use your arms, and one edge of each piece of pie is one end of the bunker and the other, and then you add them all together. But somehow, when you're on the course, it seems pretty easy. Most people like doing this too. To pick which quartile you're in, and then it's a pretty simple matter to go in with the same green target rating you determined 2 obstacles ago and have a table value. The vanilla-ness here is that this assumes, this table, although it's called the bunker rating table, the greenside bunker rating table, it assumes that there are fairway bunker or bunkers near a fairway landing zone. So it incorporates, to a certain extent, the difficulty of staying out of fairway bunkers with your long shots and staying out of greenside bunkers with your approach shots. And the whole thing spins around the definition of what do you mean by near a fairway landing zone. There are a lot of instances where the scratch player is held to a greater standard than the bogey player in terms of the addition of adjustments, and this is one of them. For the a fairway bunker to be near a fairway landing zone for a bogey, it counts anywhere along the line of play. So as soon as there's one fairway bunker on the hole, then the bogey player gets to use this table as it is. For scratch, it's more demanding. It has to be near. And if you look in the definitions at the beginning of the book, the word closely bordering has a meaning. That means 10 yards. And the word near has a very specific meaning. That means 20 yards. So there must be one point of the fairway bunker within 20 yards of one point of a scratch's landing zone in order for it to be considered near a fairway landing zone. So it's quite possible to have a bunker on the hole, and yet scratch golfer wouldn't get any credit for avoiding the fairway bunker because it's not anywhere near his landing zone. So let's take a look then at some of the adjustments, the more common adjustments that we use here. The obstacle squeeze adjustment's in for a big change. Squeeze is when you have bunkers on both sides of your landing zone, your fairway landing zone. It doesn't occur at the green. We deal with it differently at the green, but on a fairway landing zone, you get bunker squeeze. If there's bunkers within 15 yards of the middle of the fairway, it's a +1, or 10 yards, it's a +2. So what you had to do was measure from the fairway bunker, from the middle of the fairway to the fairway bunker on each side, if you had that situation, and they both had to be within 10 or 15. And so that didn't seem to be too realistic, I thought, because if one was 5 yards from the edge of the fairway and the other was 20, you've still got them, or 15, you still got them within 20 of each other. And so they've changed all of the definitions for squeeze, obstacle squeezes. So this is squeeze for bunker, squeeze for trees, squeeze for penalty areas, all the different obstacles that had a squeeze adjustment. The squeeze now is enacted by the distance between the two obstacles, not from the center to both of them. So that makes a lot of sense. So you'll see that when we get to that. Carry, there's an adjustment for carrying bunkers, and to carry a bunker, it has to protect more than half the green. What that means, protect is the word you have to say. What it means is you have to go over the bunker to get to an area of the green. If you have to go over a bunker to get to an area of the green with a straight shot, then that bunker is considered to protect that area of the green. And if you've got one big bunker at the front and it protects 5/8 of the green, then it's a carry adjustment. If it only protects 3/8 of the green, the theory being there that you don't have to carry it more times than you do have to carry it, so it doesn't come into play. And you get a carry for fairway bunkers, but once again, for the bogey golfer, any carry of a fairway bunker. To carry a fairway bunker, it's got to be right out in the fairway, obviously, not beside the fairway. But for scratch, it's got to be near, within 20 yards. If bunkers have unusual structures that make them extremely difficult to play out of, you get the E adjustment here. The depth adjustment is the significant one here, but it's hard to evaluate really, because they don't give you a lot of guidance as how to evaluate. They suggest some things, but the table talks about bunkers. The vanilliness of the table is that it assumes that all the bunkers are less than 3 feet for men, less than 2 feet for women. Consider their number, location, difficulty. There's that phrase again, difficulty of recovery, but they don't tell you how to consider it. They give you some ideas about taking a look at the bunkers that are biggest, or the ones that are most likely to be in. So you could ignore ones at the back a little bit, or certainly play them down a little bit. Anyway, you have to come up with an average or most significant fairway, a greenside bunker depth. And there are the depths. If it's greater than 3 but less, greater than 3 but less than 6, then you get a +1 adjustment. For the men, it's 3 and 6. For the ladies, it's 2 and 5. I call these the plateaus. So the plateaus for men are 3, 6, 10, and 15 to get a +1, a +2, a +3, a +4 adjustment for depth. and the plateaus were 82, 5, 8, and 12. So that comes into play a lot of the time. Next week, if we talk about the process of rating, if we have another one, I'll tell you how we do this. Here is the N adjustment, and the N adjustment relates back to the fact that this table, where you got your table value from, assumes there were fairway bunkers in play. So if there aren't, you have to adjust the table values down by 1. And there's 2 ways in which there aren't. There is the one way is it's a par 4 or a par 5, and there just aren't any at all. Or if there are, they're not near the scratch landing zone, so the scratch would have to have his value reduced by 1. The bogey wouldn't, because it's somewhere along the line of play. Or it's a par 3, where you can't have fairway bunkers in a par 3 because you don't have fairways, with one exception, and that is if it's an unreachable par 3. I'll get into this, the final one, if we do an extra one. This is one of the sticky wickets. If it's a par 3 that the bogey player can't reach, when the bogey hits that full tee shot and still doesn't get to the green, any greenside bunker that he's near can also be considered as a fairway bunker for him. So that way he wouldn't have to use the N-1 adjustment. Talk about the penalty areas first. Let's go right up to Lake. You want to do that?
Yeah, sure.
So this is new this year, the whole issue of penalty areas. And as you know, if you've done any rating this year, if you just played golf for that matter, it was part of the new simplified rules of golf. It was supposed to make golf simpler to play, and it really has, because it kind of legitimizes what a lot of recreational golfers have been doing for years anyway, and that is situations where you would normally be required to play stroke and distance, so that would be a lost ball not in a water hazard, or it would be a out of bounds. Then a lot of recreational golfers would just sort of drop one at the point of entry and treat it as if it was a water hazard and continue to play. And I don't know how you feel about legitimizing things like that, but I think it's made it a lot simpler for the golfers. Now, in terms of the course raters, then, we had out of bounds and extreme rough as one of our obstacles. And extreme rough, the golf course really wouldn't even know it was there called extreme rough. It's not a term in the rules. It's a term in the rating procedure. Raters would know what extreme rough was, a place where you're likely to lose your ball, most likely not able to find it. And if you are able to find it, very unlikely that you'd be able to hit it. And so we would have these areas that we would declare as extreme rough. The golf course would just think they were areas where people would lose balls. So now what's happened with the new rules of golf is they've clumped them all together, as you know, and called them all penalty areas. So the 3 things that are considered as penalty areas are what used to be water hazards, out of bounds, and any other area that the golf course designates as a penalty area, and we would expect them to designate areas that we would have in the past called extreme rough. But here's the problem, is when you go up to rate them now, if you're going to decide that if the golf course has already decided they're going to call that area a penalty area and have staked it with red stakes, you're fine. But if they haven't, and you rate it as a penalty area because you think it should be, it falls under the definition of the penalty area, then there has to be some communication between you and the golf course at some point. And you have to say, see that thing on number 3, that big area that's all rough and overgrown and thatched grass and whatever. That's a penalty area by our definition. So is that how you're going to play it? And if you are, you better put up some stakes. So that's been the issue. And so we no longer had a specific obstacle for water, and we no longer had a specific obstacle for OR and out of bounds and extreme rough. But all the math was done on the basis of having 10 obstacles. So they decided they want to stay with 10 obstacles. So they replaced the 2 that we lost by 2 versions of essentially the same obstacle, the penalty area. one where the penalty area has to be crossed along the line of play. So that could be what used to be called stream rough. If you had a big valley or a big ditch or something that was all full of underbrush and small trees and little things like that, where you wouldn't be able to play out of it if you could find the ball, then that would be probably rated as extreme rough by most rating teams last year. And so we find ourselves with a new obstacle called obstacle rating table penalty areas crossing. So penalty areas, things that the golf course designates as penalty areas. There are also things that we would always have designated as water hazards in the past. And so the table's pretty simple. You have a scratch length to cross the obstacle and a bogey shot length to safely cross the obstacle. And the word safely is in there, as I remember told you a couple of weeks ago. The word safely is a clue. You have to be able to hit it 10 yards further than the far margin of the hazard. And so you can see the range of shots for a scratch golfer is up to 230. That's as far as they can carry it. And the range for a bogey male golfer would be up to 180. And over here on the women's side, the appropriate dimensions are the same there. So anyway, you can see the shot length. The surprising thing is the fact that scratch gets no obstacle value for hitting a shot up to 100 yards to carry. But if you take a look at his scatter pattern for 100-yard shots, there's no chance, or for a full tee shot, if he's trying to hit a full tee shot, there's no chance he's ever going to hit it less than 100 yards. So this makes a bit more sense in relation to reality than you might originally think. So that's the crossing one. And the one thing that they've asked us to do is give special weight to this notion of partial, the percentage adjustments. Now, it's not as prevalent here. Here, it comes into play two ways. If it's very narrow or only partial, you'll see this sometimes when you have a body of water in front of a green and it's just off to the side, and half of the pin positions you'll have to cross the water to get to, and the other half you won't have to cross the water. So you would take the safe carry distance to get across the water and figure out what the table value for that safe carry was, and then possibly multiply it by 50%, because only 50% of the time do you have to make that carry. So in that case, you would get a percentage. And the percentages, to make things really simple and uniform, that we're allowed to use, that we've been instructed to use, are 25, 50, and 75. So 0 means you don't have it. 100, it's there all the time, but you could use 25, 50, or 75 based on your best judgment as to what percentage of the carry has to be made. And then this is an old familiar one, the old 2 times. We always had a 2 times adjustment before, and that is if you have to make 2 crossings on a hole and both of them are rated 5 or higher, then you take the higher one. So if you had a 5 and a 6, you take the 6 and you increase it by 1, because the total is 10 or 11. If the total is 12 or more, you increase it by 2. So if you had a 6 and a 7, you'd use the 7, increase it by 2, you'd get a 9 for the final value. So that is a good time to stop, because next time, if we do, we're going to have another one, I guess.
We actually have 2 questions.
Yeah. So let me just, so next time, I'll leave Duncan in charge of this, but I'm good to go again one more time whenever it's convenient for everybody. I'll definitely finish then, because just got a couple more simple obstacles to go, and then a couple of these sticky wicket situations I want to talk about. So, Duncan?
So we're going to go through 2 questions.
Yep.
Bob, the first one is, how do we figure out the difficulty of bunkers based on the type and depth of sand?
You don't. There's no consideration in there for type of sand, unfortunately. Let me read, I've had this question before, let me read what it says about extreme. You might be able to make an argument for using the extreme adjustment. Does it say anything here about the nature of the, no, it doesn't really say that. That question has come up a lot, but I think one of the problems is that it's too hard to quantize. Maybe you could say if the sand was like what would you consider difficult? Extremely fluffy sand, or granular rocks, tiny rocks and things like, not rocks, but you know what I mean, more granular kind of sand. I just, that question's been asked a lot over the years, and I can't give you a good answer for it. If I felt it was something that needed to be addressed, it would be difficult to do it on every trap on a course. That's every bunker on a course. That's the problem. But if it was one specific bunker where the quality of the and you're absolutely certain it's a bunker, not a waste area, then I would probably resort to the extreme +1 adjustment. Paul Fitzgerald, the late Paul Fitzgerald, who kind of taught me and was my mentor back when I was learning to do this, always said the book, you have to know the manual cover to cover, because that tells you the science of course rating. He said, but there's a thing on top of that called the art of course rating. So he was always very encouraging of his people that he was teaching to rate, to try to put some of their own intention into it. And something like this, he would say, yeah, I think that warrants.
The other question we have was, with the increased length and carry due to fitness and equipment, particularly for scratch player, will they modify the shot length?
No, that's an easy one to answer. You can't do that, because if you do that, then you've got to go out and rate every golf course in the world the next day. So what this means simply is that you remember the reason we have a course rating system is to form a basis for our handicap system. So everybody says, well, what are you going to have then when people are hitting at 300 yards? I says, you're going to have more people with a positive handicap. That's all. That's as far as that's the only possible outcome that's acceptable, because we can't change the whole. It's even worse now because the whole world's doing it this way with the World Handicap System. We're all using the same USGA course rating guide. So I'm afraid that's the only answer, but it's a good question. But it just means that there are a lot more people who are better than scratch.